Well, hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Pete Erickson, the CEO and founder of Modev, and today's webinar is going to be fantastic, where we are talking about custom assistants. I have been so fortunate to have a front row seat on the conversational AI space going back to about 2015, and I've watched this whole market emerge and founded Voice in 2017 and have hosted thousands of people from around the world. And we certainly all watched this hype cycle in the conversational AI space, largely built around the assistants that we know very well that are part of our kitchens and living rooms. However, during that time, there's been an entire industry that has been growing at a regular clip behind the scenes, building conversational AI beyond the assistants. And one of the companies that has been leading that charge is Voicify. And our guests today are executives in that company that have a front row seat on the conversational AI space. They're very steeped into the technology and very knowledgeable when it comes to not just custom assistants, but basically all things voice. So I'm excited about today's webinar, and I want to introduce our co-panelists, Mr. Jason Fields, Chief Strategy Officer at Voicify, and Alex Dunn, Chief Product Officer. Gentlemen, if you could take just a moment and introduce yourselves, that would be great.
Alex, you first.
Okay, I'll go first. Hey everyone, I'm Alex Dunn. I'm the Chief Product Officer, like Pete said. My background for the last 10 years has been in enterprise application and AI development and in assistive technology. I joined Voicify way back at the beginning when we first kicked things off, 4 or 5 years ago, and have been mostly focused on creating new advancements in the voice space and making sure that I'm sharing those things along the way, trying to demystify these bigger concepts of creating voice assistants.
And I'm Jason Fields. I'm the Chief Strategist with Voicify. And similar to Alex, I have a long tenure in technology. I worked in pro-serve organizations for the past 15 or 20 years, helping organizations really push their technology stacks to create transformational opportunities for the business in terms of product and revenue, as well as experiences for their consumers and employees.
Thanks, guys. And I want to add that both Jason and Alex have been strong contributors to this space. They're willing to share what they know. We just did a webinar, Jason, with you 2 months ago, where you talked about real world examples, implementations with companies like Volkswagen, J&J, and others. I think Wolverine was another one.
Yeah.
And these real life implementations are vital for people to really understand the value of conversational AI and how it's being utilized by companies. And Alex, you're a regular contributor online. You share what you know, and for developers that are out there, definitely follow Alex down, because he's gonna share what he's learning along the way, which is just fabulous. So, gentlemen, we're going to get into it here. And for everybody that is on the webinar, be sure to drop your questions in the Q&A, and let's get started. So if I'm a brand and I've invested money and I'm on these other platforms, would I be smart also to be thinking about a custom assistant now in addition to those other platforms? Is this an and, or is it an or?
I think it's an and for a lot of brands, especially if you already have something out in those ecosystems. Now, whether or not you made the technical choice at the beginning of that development cycle to build it in a way that could be compatible with other endpoints may be a limitation in that decision making, but likely if you've done something that has functionality and use on one of the general purpose assistants, it would be made of good use in your existing channels digitally that you own. But I think moving forward, and by the way, I'm not trying to create an aura of negativity around the general purpose assistants, but they do have their limitations. And the custom voice assistants or branded voice assistants become really important when you start moving outside of the limitations that those platforms put on top of you, to a point that Alex made and is a big buzzword in our organization. There's got to be a sort of a critical business issue that a voice assistant can lean into to help solve, for it to be a meaningful part of that experience. And oftentimes putting it only on platforms like Google and Alexa can talk a business out of wanting to do it at all, because they're not fully owning it.
Yeah, to expand on that a little bit more. I almost see it like as yes and, but also more, because of those, potential limitations. And of course, these limitations are in place in order to protect the consumers that are using the assistants. As someone who uses, Alexa speakers like the one behind me, or even, Google speakers, naturally, I use them all. But as a regular consumer, I don't necessarily want to give up my information to a third party brand if I'm already giving it up to Amazon. And there's, because of that, as like a core concept, these barriers were put up, and they're there to in theory protect the consumer. They're also there just to protect, the ability of the assistant, and making sure that people aren't having a bad experience that they essentially blame on, an Alexa or a Siri at the fault of a third party. But when you own your own assistant, you can do a lot more. And so you can take those experiences that you may have already shipped as an Alexa skill or a Google action, and bring that same delight, that same stickiness, those same things where voice is good, for your user, to your other platforms, or even to new platforms entirely, where it can create unique experiences.
Alex, you had talked when we were backstage, you talked a little bit about BBC.
Mhm.
I think it's an interesting case study in this. Can you share a little bit about what happened there?
Yeah. So, BBC had created an Alexa skill in Google Action. This is way back, like sort of at the beginning of third party skills and actions being something that developers could touch on. Shipped it, was great. They had usage. But what they found was a limitation in the amount of information they could use and how they could reach their consumers in new ways, right? That you're limited to the scope of the way you can even just model a conversation on those platforms. So rather than, saying and in those use cases, they said or, and went and built their own assistant and removed a lot of their content and conversational experiences from those platforms, and shipped their own, called Beeb, or the Beeb, and on top of that, ship their own hardware as well to put the assistant. So people who had an affinity for BBC content, and wanted to access it more easily, rather than having to now go buy an Amazon or a Google product or a Samsung product or something like that, they would be buying it directly from BBC. And there's a difference in user experience for sure. There's also a difference in how they think about their data, their usage, your voice being heard from a third party platform, and that exchange we give as consumers to give up that information to get the functionality of a voice assistant and the benefits of it, but giving it to just BBC, and having that trust with that brand separate from, and now there's sort of multiple layers of trust that's required, from one of these other general assistant platforms that people can build on.
Do you know how it's done? I haven't tracked any of the adoption.
We had some numbers. It did pretty well. They also, their content was then made available in other places through voice too, like their mobile app and web platforms too. Yeah. So like I don't know the usage on like the actual hardware, but it gets significant usage through their apps, mostly because it's a convenient way to get to content immediately, right? You sort of just say what you want and you get it.
Right. Well, it's an interesting, that particularly is an interesting case study, because a lot of the stories that have been coming out recently about Alexis, that people use it for a very narrow set of purposes, right? To listen to music, check the weather. It's interesting. And so custom assistants, definitely, that's a great example. I think it's probably one of the early examples of doing this. We have somebody with their hand up. They're actually a phone caller. So in order to allow them to ask their question, I'll need to allow them to talk. Are you guys okay with that?
Sure.
Okay. Sure. So who's ever just put up their hand on their phone, I'm going to push allow to talk. And if you've got your question ready, please go ahead. Hello, are you there?
Yep.
Go ahead.
So I am blind, which is why I called in, because I use a screen reader and I don't want it to be yammering away while you all are doing this awesome presentation.
Thank you.
So I was wondering, I'm also in part of the Open Voice Network.
Great.
I'm wanting to get my content. I have a podcast that I'm putting together and everything, but I'm wanting to make it so that like my written content is connected to the voice.
That your written content goes text to speech and then it's made available, correct?
Yeah. I mean,
Great.
I guess I'm wanting it to be connected to like Google Assistant and everything.
Okay, great. We can talk about text to speech. Guys, you want to take that? And thank you so much for your call, and thanks for being a part of Open Voice Network. They're a great resource for this industry, and they're going to be heavily involved in voice this fall. So thanks so much for your question.
Yep.
Guys?
Sure. So, in regard to text to speech, I mean, I sort of want to start as a general concept. Text to speech is something that's been around for a while, and it's gone through many different variations and iterations and quality and things like that, from robo voices to snipping together audio clips that were pre-recorded to synthetic voices that were okay, to things like WaveNet and more advanced high quality human voices. As a concept, though, it's something that does extend beyond just an assistant, right? Something that I should say a conversational assistant. It's something that you use to bring your personality to your assistant. But, in the use case that, the caller just mentioned in trying to make content more accessible, approaching those problems is exactly where the same tools that we use to build conversational AI and voice AI can exist to help others. It's something that I've always been so fascinated by. And we talk about these concepts of building voice assistants and helping, brands get out there and interact with their users in new ways. A big part of a lot of this technology, both the core components of things like speech to text, speech recognition, and text to speech, is an immediately accessible tool to make your content more accessible too. So I actually really like that use case. And there's tons of tools out there for just text to speech. Obviously, all the big players, the same people we're talking about, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook / Meta, all have their own text to speech providers that you can use. There's costs associated with those, of course, over time. And then there's also other great platforms like Well Said Labs, Read Speaker, and things like that help you bring your own voice to it. So I guess, like, in terms of the space and how TTS, specifically text to speech, comes into play with custom assistants, it's also, I think, an important aspect that, going back to one of our previous points, and one of the benefits of thinking about building your own assistant, is you actually get to own not just the content, but the actual way that the user is interacting with it, and that feel, and of course the actual voice itself. With some of the newer technology and being able to create your own custom synthetic voice with relatively little data, and now you've sort of owned an entire experience. You're not relying on something like Poly or Google TTS, but you can really end-to-end own not just how a user interacts with you, but how you also interact back to it, and it creates a sort of brand identity on its own.
I think it's a great point. I mean, I think that it's that's one of the big benefits of custom assistants. Let's look at the evolution. Your report does a couple things. One, it talks about what are brand priorities when it comes to voice. Maybe we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll talk about kind of where the evolution. We talked about BBC, but there's another case study in here that I think is interesting with a major bank. But the first thing I noticed in the report is, what are organizations really looking for when it comes to voice, right? So 82% are looking for improved productivity, 77% are looking for new business opportunities, and 62% are looking for increased revenue. I think it's interesting, pretty fair to say that overall, they see conversational AI as a way to improve the bottom line. Where would you say most organizations are, though, when it comes to rolling out conversational AI, whether it's a custom system or not? Would love for either one of you to take that.
Well, I think that Alex and I may have different perspectives on this, which is, I guess, the fun of a fireside chat. What I'm seeing in the conversations that I have with prospects and with customers is that the first entry point into conversational AI tends to orient itself around the voice user interface itself. So when you start looking at existing digital assets like a native mobile app or a website, or even a system that lives on a proprietary device in, say, like a warehouse setting, the first place that you want to start is to Voicify. And I'm not trying to sell the brand, just happens to be our name. But you want to Voicify the features and functionality that are already proving to be effective in your business. So when you look at, say, like a warehouse setting, if somebody has to pick up a a device and tap and swipe and move through a visual user interface in order to achieve something like understanding where they should go next, or understanding where the package they're holding needs to go. Being able to ask that question and hear a response, or perhaps hear a response and see a response either on that same device, or perhaps even something as innovative as like augmented reality goggles. Having the modalities paired together offers an extraordinary power to that function, rather than demanding it only be experienced through one user interface. You could translate that over into consumer-facing brands as well. We're working with a number of customers on bringing voice controls or voicifying the functionality inside of their native mobile apps. Now, if you're a broadcasting company or a streaming company, that probably has a lot to do with finding the content that you're hunting for, stopping it, queuing it, favoriting it, right? All of these things that we're used to doing through a visual user interface on our devices can be more easily accomplished, i.e. reducing friction through a voice interface. What's nice about that approach is that it tends to offer a lower barrier to entry for most brands, because it doesn't feel like a whole hog investment in something, as it does leaning into a new way of interfacing with their customer or with their end user, if they're an employee or whatnot. It also builds off of things that have already been proven out. So if you have something that's running successfully in market or at the back of house that is proving to be successful from a functionality standpoint, it probably makes sense to consider a voice interface for that. Very quickly thereafter, it becomes apparent that there are things that you can achieve with your voice conversationally or in parity with other modalities that will bring more power to the user and more information to the brand. And while our report calls out things like improved productivity and business opportunities and increased revenue, if you unpack any of those KPIs, what you find is that it's not a first touch attribution or a last touch attribution. It tends to be a linear attribution, where everything that happens inside of the journey to achieve that goal brings some value to it. And the voice interactivity is one of those touch points that is now increasing the value of existing or new touch points to those bottom lines. It's not like a light switch on a wall.
Got it. As I look at the evolution of voice, and a lot of us, in this industry, we talked about in the introduction, the hype cycle, but are we really, we're really in a new era of, I think, of conversational AI. It's almost like it is the evolution, but now we're here, and custom assistance is really where the market is going right now. When I think about, we're a Comcast customer, Xfinity customer, and we have the X1 remote. Now that's pretty much what we use. Our Apple TV, by the way, has the voice button as well. So with our TV, we're pretty much exclusively now using our voice as the interface. Those are two different custom assistants that help drive our entertainment. What I see in your report here, in 2018, Erica was born at Bank of America. And do I have this right? Is this where this is going now?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Without a doubt. Now, you could say we're biased because we built a company around it, but let the metrics speak for themselves. I mean, when you look at what happened with Bank of America's native mobile app, when they essentially voicified their experience, they increased their engagement in their native mobile app by 200% in the first year. And that was across all generational segments, right? So it wasn't just the younger people that were doing it. It was also the older people and people in the middle of their lives that were engaging with the voice controls and the voice interface inside of that native mobile app. And there's other examples that give you the same thing. I think the important piece is conversational AI has moved past its novelty stage, right? When web started, we were putting cams on aquariums and making that a web page, and it was what's the low tide in Anacortes, Washington, and it was these like novelty things. And then it moved past and got into publishing, and then advertising came on board. And now the idea of not being able to log into a website to manage my finances is mind-boggling to any of us, right?
Right.
So we've moved past novelty with conversational AI and with custom voice assistants, and we're moving into those critical business issues where businesses and consumers alike can see real difference.
It's an exciting time. I'm seeing the Q&A has a question. I'm going to pop in there now and see what we got. Okay. From Jack Rieger, does custom assistance always require a wake word name? What is the best way to go about creating and executing this? Who would host this custom service? Great question.
Yeah, I could probably answer that from at least a somewhat technical side. So first of all, no, you don't have to build a custom assistant with a wake word. It's a way to engage in an entirely hands-free way. There is still value in adding voice interaction, even if you still require a touch point, a physical touch point. For example, even something like Beeb inside the BBC app, being able to tap and then still speak after doing a tap to get to content directly cuts down on like navigation requirements, right? It's you're sacrificing the one tap for not having to do many or get lost along the way. However, wake word is a very good way to execute an entirely hands-free way to interact with an assistant, and it opens up more doors for new experiences you can build. There's a number of people playing in the wake word space, and it comes down to a couple of different approaches. Namely, to get a little bit technical, there's essentially two ways to do wake word. One is modeling a very small model that can run on even like a single core CPU that's based on listening for certain wave patterns in the audio itself. It doesn't actually do speech to text, and then it can trigger to open up the mic for a streamed speech recognition session. That's, for example, how things like Alexa and Google Assistant typically work on their speaker devices or even in their app. There's also the approach of doing more dynamic wake word capabilities with being able to basically do actual speech recognition throughout and then wait for certain triggers. It's interesting with those situations, you can supply multiple different wake words that can do different things, which also in theory allows you to have even the potential of multiple assistants in a single environment. In terms of executing, there's a couple different open source approaches for it, but it requires a lot of training data to do that first way, that audio recognition way, because you need to cover lots of different people's accents, lots of different tones, distances from a microphone in order to build a very small model. And that challenge, it also is required in order to make sure you're not getting false positives, because one of the things that you need to think about when building a custom assistant is ensuring that you're guaranteeing the user's privacy and that they have that trust for the assistant. It's a lot to ask someone to give access to their voice and to their microphone. And if you have a lot of false positives, you run a risk of people breaking and losing that trust. Now, the other approach of doing it based off found words and doing offline speech recognition, there's not a lot of people in that space. That's something that we do at Voicify, not to like plug our actual platform too much, but we do have like offline wake word technology that does speech recognition throughout in order to trigger different assistants and things like that. And it requires less training, but the payoff is you need a multi-core CPU essentially. So you can run it in an app, you can run it on like a Raspberry Pi or even an Arduino, but you can't really run it on like a tiny little earbud or something like that.
Alex, you know your stuff. Thank you so much. What a great detailed answer. Let's talk a little bit about budgeting. When people think about custom assistants, I'm sure they might, think like, what should I be thinking about? What's the scope of this going to be? And I think, having gone through the hype cycle, and maybe they did invest quite a bit in a custom skill or action or both. How does this compare? And what should I be thinking about if I'm a company that really wants to move into this space?
It's a very fair and often asked question of both Alex and I in our daily lives, and one that we don't have an exact answer for. And the reason is, as any professional services, and we're not, but we come from the pro-serve world. Any pro-serve professional is going to tell you that there's going to be a number of different variables that are going to influence that. So let's talk through the variables. The first one is use case, right? If I want to set up a custom voice assistant that tells you the time of day, that's a very simple use case. I can plug into a time of day service and bring back that information and give it to you. But if I want to plug in my custom voice assistant to one, two, or many backend systems in order to draw multiple pieces of information in order to share intent and meaning to the user of the voice assistant, that's going to be a much more robust experience, not just technically, but also from a design standpoint. And I think that's one of the areas that scares or makes nervous a lot of brands, which is they don't know exactly where to start. The fact of the matter is with any new technology, there's going to be a smaller group of professionals or skill sets that you can draw from in order to bring it to life. As the technology matures, that pool of talent becomes bigger. But what we're finding, and we found this with ourselves because we had to invent this when we started, was you draw on very similar experiences and skill sets that you've used in previous digital technology. So there were frameworks that were set up for native mobile development from a design standpoint. There were frameworks that have been set up for web development. All of those are in some way or form transferable into what should or could be done with voice. But the most important question that's going to influence budget is how broad of a set of functionality is the custom voice assistant going to take. I think a reasonable amount of time to get it's sort of an alpha released, and it depends on how you're going to go about it. If you're custom developing something, it's going to take much longer to do. If you're using like a platform like Voicify, again, not to try and plug us, but if you're using a platform like ours, we've seen people get up and running with basic use cases in a matter of days or weeks. Obviously, if you need to connect a system or your code to a third party, it could take a little bit more time, but you should be able to get something up and running within 30, 60, 90 days.
Yeah, there's another side of the cost as well, and that does also scale with the complexity of what you're building. And it really comes down to like you need to host the assistant somewhere, and it needs to be able to handle interactions. So things like, what tool are you going to use for wake word? What are you going to use for speech recognition? What are you going to use for your actual dialogue and in the actual conversational AI? And what are you going to use for TTS? And then what are you going to use to get data back and forth as part of that conversational AI? And each of those, have their own assumed costs. You need to pick a provider for either a combination of those pieces or for an individual piece to pull out. And every platform's got its own fees and things as well. But when it comes to the cost at scale, if you're building an assistant that handles a few thousand conversations every month, it's, you can run that on basically a potato if you wanted to. But if you wanted to build something that's going to be servicing billions of interactions and, millions of users, if that's the type of usage you would expect, like someone like the Beeb or someone like Erica, then you need to handle that scale. And I think it also goes back to why there's so much interest in custom assistants, like you mentioned earlier, Pete, helping support the bottom line for the business. Because in the end, if you're investing rather than just looking at it as pure cost, like if you're investing the money to build an assistant that's going to drive new opportunities and new revenue for you, or even just optimize certain experiences, then in theory, it could pay for itself.
So I'd love to talk a little bit about where custom assistants live. I think that we certainly are used to the idea of devices in our homes, and we're now, I think, more used to the idea of that our smartphones have a custom assistant on them. I mentioned remote controls. Let's talk about some other places though where custom assistants might live.
There's
Definitely
no shortage of opportunities in that area.
So the thing that I say, and this is going to sound, kind of ridiculous, but like we like to put custom assistants anywhere where we can get a microphone and a speaker and or a screen. So like anywhere where we can get input from a user through their voice or through text, and somewhere where we can talk back to them or show them something. And there's obviously, like Jason said, no shortage of that. So from assistants in your car, most cars ship with their own, form of voice commands, but to actually be an assistant is something else. To inside your own native mobile app, which, now is living alongside the root level assistant like Google Assistant or Bixby for Android devices, and obviously Siri for iOS devices. But even things like in VR and AR headsets, Jason mentioned a use case before in industry, where someone is a warehouse worker with goggles on and can actually interact with things in an augmented reality situation using their voice, to smartwatches, earbuds, and even like the actual appliances themselves in your home, not just, the smart speakers that can interact with them, but actually putting, microphones in microwaves. I've always thought that's the funniest use case I've seen for somewhere where someone put an Alexa is, I don't know why I need to talk to my microwave when I also have to still go up to it to put the food in, but to each their own. Anywhere essentially we can get that microphone, speaker, and or a screen is potentially a place to put a custom assistant.
My favorite terrifying example is at CES a few years ago. Somebody put Alexa in a shower head. And I'm not sure why I needed Alexa in the shower with me. But Pete, I think to take a different tact on Alex's response, which is where can we be putting voice assistants? Going back to that use case is going to dictate that, right? If I'm a QSR, a quick serve restaurant brand, then putting a custom voice assistant in my drive-through probably makes sense, or putting it in kiosks inside of the restaurant. But if I'm in that warehouse scenario, putting that inside of a headset that somebody's wearing, or AR goggles, is going to make the most sense. So the goal, I think, for any brand shouldn't be put a voice assistant everywhere, make it always available all the time. It needs to be, and this goes back to some of that design framework for conversational AI, there has to be a contextual awareness of what's meaningful and appropriate, and then you can choose the hardware.
Yeah, look, the microwave example is actually a great example of voice, because microwaves are incredibly difficult. I mean, they remind me of the old VCRs. It's like, yeah. I mean, and most people just use the 30-second plus button, or they use the popcorn or the beverage button, right? But honestly, a lot of times you may be putting something in to thaw something out, and you could just say what you're doing. I'm thawing out a pound of beef, and it's like, okay, got that, and it's like, I think that it's a great example. Maybe other appliances are good examples as well, because sometimes it's very difficult to navigate those appliances. Alexa, find me a plumber. Right on.
Yeah,
spot
definitely
on.
could have used that a few times.
Alexa, buy more shampoo. Let's see.
I have done that. I have said buy more shampoo while in the shower, not with the shower head one, but with an echo in the other room yelling across my house.
So I would love to hear what's on your mind, folks, whether it's a specific question or just a comment. Are any of you currently deploying custom assistants, thinking about deploying custom assistants? We have a great opportunity while we're having this discussion to maybe address anything that may be on your mind. One thing, guys, that's on my mind is that Google just announced that they're pulling out of Europe, a number of different countries. Now, I think this is obviously related to privacy and the way that Google manages privacy, but I think this is a good example. If I'm a brand and I've just invested heavily into a Google action in one of these countries, and then suddenly I've just been deplatformed because I can no longer access because of Google's choice to pull out. Doesn't this underscore the importance of a custom assistant approach?
It does.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Alex, go.
First.
No, you go for it. But
okay. I was gonna say it does. And honestly, it shows. I personally think it should show a level of distrust to the user with what they're like. If Google can't conform to privacy policies that are meant to protect consumers, that's exactly why you would want a custom voice assistant that does. The main reason, and I believe, again, I'm gonna make a little bit of speculation here, but this was coming out of the new guidelines for virtual voice assistants that came out of the EDPB, the European Data Protection Bureau. So, a lot of those new laws that came into place is how that your voice is used, how your information that's tracked through your conversations is used and correlated back to you, and in turn sold and used for advertising in other ways, or in a number of other ways, really. That's exactly why you'd want a custom assistant, and why you would want, as a user, to be able to interact with a custom assistant. And it's the same reason why people like the Bee pulled out before they were deplatformed. They Uno reverse carded them and said, well, we want to be able to protect and own our users' experience. And the best way to do that is to have that custom experience. And it's worked for them, right? People actually use their assistant. So I think it's a huge reason for users to look at custom assistants and the ones that are still running in the EU. And it's also a big reason for brands to think about actually creating those custom assistants for their users to interact with, because it may be, at least for the short term or some foreseeable future, the only way you're going to be able to get a voice interaction and an experience in front of your users to provide those things like, productivity and conveniences that obviously a voice interaction can bring.
Got a great question here. Thanks, Alex. I got a great question here from Cornelia Davis. Can a custom assistant be built leveraging the infrastructure and services available through the big players like Alexa, Google, et cetera?
I guess it depends on what you would consider the infrastructure and services, right? So there's, you can build a custom assistant and make use of things like AWS's services for speech to text and TTS, like Polly. Same thing with Google, right? You can use Google speech to text and Google TTS without having to use Google Assistant. That absolutely, but you still got to build that sort of decision engine in between, and what actually is going to be the conversational AI part. You can't use their wake words. You can't create an assistant and use, Alexa's wake word technology on your own speaker and then pretend to be Alexa. One, it's a technical challenge, and two, it's a licensing issue. But in terms of, the same core components, there's nothing, necessarily magical about what Alexa and Google have built with their assistants. It's wake words, it's speech recognition, it's decisioning and NLU and NLP. It's talking to your own data behind the scenes, and it's text to speech. You break down those individual pieces, you can build them independently or use other platforms for them, or even use AWS or Google or Azure or any other service to build those pieces, and you put them together to build your own assistant that you now own how each of those pieces play together.
Maybe a related question for Victor. Any thoughts on using the new Alexa Conversations deep learning tool to create multi-turn experiences? So I think that's a little bit deeper ML based tool. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've done quite a bit of work with Alexa Conversations. It requires so much work in labeling in order to build a successful multi-turn conversation. And even still, when you're building those conversations, ideally you're doing something multi-turn because you need to get to the point of either getting data on behalf of a user or doing something for them, at which point you still have to write your own code and logic anyway in order to successfully implement that Alexa skill. It does shortcut some of the things like, can I have this intent in these slots after this other one? But I think that's more of just like working around a limitation of flattened NLU than it is making it easier for developers. I think it also does open the door a little bit more to people from the data science point of view, because they are used to that experience of labeling data, building a model, and then working against the output rather than having to write the code and the business logic from scratch. So I guess those are my thoughts on Alexa Conversations in general, in that approach to building an assistant. I guess to summarize that, there's a challenge with black box modeling that doesn't entirely address the problem that it wants to, which is it's so tedious to build everything from scratch. There's something in the middle that we should be leaning on to use machine learning where it's appropriate and to not sacrifice convenience of and flexibility of building something your own.
Thanks, Alex. Have you done any work with Rasa or NVIDIA's Riva?
I've used Rasa. I've not used Riva. It's on my list. Rasa is an extremely powerful tool. I'm a big fan of Rasa in how they approach the NLU problem. I think just the general concept of the transformer approach to modeling NLU and NLP is something that we've seen a ton of success out of. And that is that approach that I think is a lot closer to that in between of like get the ML to do what it's good at and be able to make predictions and parse through large amounts of data, but you still have that total control because they're just really supplying that NLU and some tools to work around it than they are building an entirely opinionated black box AI model, to go to the extreme of that side, like something like GPT-3 and OpenAI, where you got, very little control over it. That's the charm of using OpenAI is you supply very little data and you get surprisingly good results. But of course, when you don't get the results you want, you're kind of out of luck.
Right. Yeah, and we've noticed NVIDIA making it more known their voice capabilities, and it's just interesting to see them really starting to raise their hand with regards to their voice capabilities lately. Very cool. Well, I'd love to get your guys' thoughts as we look to sort of head for home on this webinar. Where do you think we'll be a year from now as an industry relative to custom assistants? I think right now it's like the folks that are on this webinar, we're all certainly talking about it. We can sort of see where things are moving. When will we be really just thinking about custom assistants as an industry, and that's really where things are going? Are we there yet, or will we be there in a year's time, 2 years' time?
You want to go first, Alex?
Sure. I think in a year's time, potentially, I think the big missing pieces with it becoming standard is honestly more people doing it so that the consumer is more, I guess, like
used to the idea.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like we get the benefit, and I'm going to steal something that I know Jason Fields loves to bring up, but I always appreciate this thought as well. As brands that are building custom assistants, we get the benefit of what Amazon and Google have done with teaching users how to talk to brands, right? I know I can talk to Amazon, and I know I can talk to Google and interact with my Amazon world and interact with my Google world through the assistant. And building a custom assistant, you get the benefit of consumers being more trained in that type of interaction. But I think in terms of becoming, a staple in a mainstream concept, it just requires more of those familiar places that users are already going to, making it easier to interact. Now, someone, for example, who is a Bank of America customer and also an Amazon customer, a big part of their life, they likely control through a voice assistant now, through a couple different ones. The more that there's these safer, more trustworthy interactions that are built by these brands for their consumers, I think the snowball will roll from there, because everyone else is going to want to be able to provide those same, more joyful experiences to their consumers and their users.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say something extraordinarily similar, which is I think in 12 to 18 months, we're going to start seeing it's unfortunately named, but the Amazon effect in voice, right? You look back at any company who had a logistics component of their business, they lost it a big way when they didn't pivot as quickly as Amazon did with making sure that people could get packages within a day or even hours if you live in a metropolis, right?
Right.
I think we're going to start seeing that critical mass start hitting with individual brands where the peer pressure is going to be built up. And whether you're in the sneaker industry, the automotive industry, the insurance industry, now the expectation from the consumer experience standpoint is voice should be here. Why isn't it?
Right. Right. No, I think that's a good point. I think about mobile applications as well, right? So there's a UX requirement now for mobile applications. People have an expectation of just about how easy it's going to be. The next layer is going to be, can I interact with that application with my voice? Because that's the next tap and swipe. Yeah. So I think you all are spot on that we will see it as an expectation. I love the logistics thing. I mean, Amazon did, next day, now it's same day, but everybody's got to have that, whether you order from another, big box store or someone else. The expectation is now that those logistics are on par with that. And I think it's a great analogy. Any other thoughts as we kind of, as we wrap up today's conversation? Anything else that you want to leave our panelists or anybody out there? We're recording, so anybody out there, any thoughts about where we're headed?
I mean, I think Alex and I both remain extremely excited about this space. If we weren't lucky enough to be in jobs where we get to think about this all day, we'd be doing it in our spare time. So we're both bullish on the capability and what it can mean for the consumers. And I want to reiterate, I think we're moving away from novelty at a really fast pace right now. And I think that's really important to business. And I think it's really important to consumers, because Jeopardy was the #1 Alexa skill for a very long time. It may still be, actually. And it brought a lot of joy to the people who love Jeopardy and play it, and that's fine. But it wasn't functionally meaningful for business or for consumers. We're on that path now, and it excites me.
Yeah, I think for me, on top of everything that Jason just said, and doing it in our free time, even if we didn't do it, for our full time, I personally love the continued adoption of voice technology. I think it helps level the playing field by creating a different, human-computer interaction paradigm. The more that it's widely available, the more accessible content, features, and services become to people with differing abilities, and basically everybody in between. From just being able to access content that was otherwise hard to get to in an app, because navigating around and on a small screen deep into page after page after page to get to the right thing versus just saying it, I think is a big step forward. But it's still just one of the early steps, all the way into these future use cases of putting assistants in places where it's just so convenient and useful. The more that we as brands and builders create these experiences that function and help people, the wider it's going to be adopted, and the more that we sort of level that playing field for everyone on the consumer side too. So those are some of the things I'm definitely the most excited about when it comes to custom assistants and the types of opportunities it brings. And just to reiterate something I think I've hammered this entire conversation is the taking back the privacy issues and trust issues that voice technology has slipped into in a couple ways. And it seemed like there was, in early days, people didn't want to use a microphone connected to the internet, and it created new convenient experiences that were worth it. And, you made that exchange of your information for that convenience. I think we're at the point now where you don't have to sacrifice as much of your personal information to gain the same conveniences or new experiences. And that's another thing that I'm very excited about.
I love it. Definitely exciting times. Well, if people are interested in following up and finding out more about Voicify, please, can you share with us how best to get in touch with you?
Sure. I mean, voicify.com is our website. You can contact us through there. There's an 800 number. We're on Twitter at Voicify. We're on LinkedIn. Alex and I, it's both first initial, last name at voicify.com. Feel free to drop us a line and we'll start a conversation.
Excellent.
You'll talk to the real us and not the virtual version.
We're going to be human first on those conversations.
By the way, your avatars are great. I swear, it's very lifelike.
Just the man behind the curtain.
Right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on again and just sharing so much about what you know. It's an exciting time in the world of conversational AI. We are seeing the next iteration of the revolution. Conversational AI has been around for a long time, right? Go all the way back to HAL, right? But I think that we've seen that first wave, and now we're seeing the next wave. And I think utility and value are cornerstones for the next wave, and Voicify is on the bleeding edge of that. So thank you so much for joining us. For everybody that joined us today, thank you so much for tuning in. And again, we will have this recording. We're going to do a little post-production work on it, but we're going to make it available. And this report that we've been talking about custom assistants is going to go out to everybody that was part of this webinar. So check your emails for the download link for the Voicify Inside Custom Assistants report. So I'm Pete Erickson with Modev. It's been great joining you today. Jason and Alex, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Take care, everyone.